Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Zelensky hold first telephone conversation since Russia's invasion of China calls all sides to seek a way for peace. Navalny says he faces new terrorism charges as Russia court mutes his speech from jail. Plus, U.S. President Joe Biden says nuclear subs to dock in South Korea to deter Pyongyang. Thank you so much for joining us. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says China represented an opportunity to reinforce the rules that peace should be built upon after speaking to the Chinese president on the phone. The two leaders spoke yesterday for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, fulfilling a long-standing goal of Kiev, which had publicly sought such talks for months. The Chinese president told Zelensky that China will send special representatives to Ukraine and hold talks with all parties seeking peace. President Zelensky also said President Xi had expressed words of support for the extension of a deal to support Ukrainian grain ports from its Black Sea ports. Meanwhile, a Chinese official says Chinese President Xi Jinping's phone conversation with his Ukrainian counterpart, Vladimir Zelensky, shows the great importance China attaches to growing its relations with Ukraine and China's willingness to maintain cooperation in all fields. Now, Yun Jun, the Deputy Chief of the Department of European Central Asian Affairs of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, noted that China and Ukraine, as strategic partners, have maintained the steady growth of bilateral relations, kept close communication, and developed economic ties over the past few decades. While COVID-19 and the outbreak of the conflict has affected much, it hasn't changed the trade relationship between the two countries. On the Ukraine crisis, Yu says that since the full escalation of the war, China, as a responsible major country and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has been committed to promoting peace talks in an objective and impartial manner, and has stayed in communication with relevant parties. Staying with China, the country has called on all sides to reflect on the situation in Ukraine and seek a new way to reach peace in Europe. Chinese state media says during the phone call to President Zelensky from President Xi that China will send special representatives to Ukraine and indeed hold talks with all parties seeking peace. The most powerful world leader to have refrained from denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese president, made a state visit to Russia last month. Since February, he has promoted a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, greeted with skepticism from the West, but cautiously welcomed by Kiev. President Xi also told Zelensky that China will focus on promoting peace talks and make efforts for a ceasefire as soon as possible. Following the call, President Zelensky immediately signaled the importance of the chance to open closer relationships with Russia's most powerful friend, naming a former cabinet minister as Ukraine's new ambassador to Beijing. Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny was seen for the first time in months, days after his associates voiced growing concern over his health in prison. Attending a Moscow court hearing via video link from his penal colony in the city of Kovrov, the Russian opposition leader appeared to have lost weight but smiled as he interacted with his supporters in court. After making opening remarks alluding to the time he's recently spent in solitary confinement, his video link was muted by the court. The court hearing was closed from media, but it was reported that Navalny said investigations had opened what he called an absurd terrorism case against him that could see him sentenced to an additional 30 years in jail. Mr. Navalny said it was absurd to argue he'd committed terrorism while in prison. He said the case will be tried by a military court. Meanwhile, Kremlin critic and former mayor of Yekaterinburg, Yevgeny Roizman, pleaded not guilty as he appeared in court charged with discrediting the Russian army. The prominent opposition figure in the area, Russia's fourth largest city, is accused of calling what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine a war, and likening the Z symbol of the Russian forces to the Nazi swastika during a live stream on YouTube. Mr. Roizman, who had been fined 3 times for the same offense, now faces 3 years in prison. The Russian authorities have so far launched over 6,500 cases under the controversial law, according to human rights monitoring group, the OVD Info, including against people who staged solo anti-war demonstrations, posted their opinions online, or worse, anti-war symbols on their clothes. Romanian Agriculture Minister Petri Day says the European Commission will ban Ukrainian grain and oilseeds exports to Romania until June the 5th, with access to its own Black Sea ports blocked and later limited by Russia's invasion. Ukraine, one of the world's leading grain exporters, has had to find alternative shipping routes through neighboring countries. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia took unilateral steps to ban imports of Ukrainian farm products in response to complaints from their farmers over demand and prices of local product, while Romania stopped short of enforcing a ban. Day says the Commission's ban and compensation for their farmers were available on condition of the other 4 countries reversing unilateral bans. Now, if an agreement is not reached, Day says the Commission will move to ban Ukrainian grain exports specifically to Romania. Russia's envoy to the United Nations in Geneva says that no real progress has been achieved in resolving issues raised by Moscow over the Black Sea grain deal, which is set to expire next month. Now, Russia had signaled that unless a list of demands is met to remove obstacles to Russia's grain and fertilizer exports, it will not agree to extend a related deal beyond May the 18th that allows the safe wartime export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered between Russia and Ukraine by the United Nations in Turkey last July, aimed to prevent a global food crisis by allowing Ukrainian grain blockaded by Russia's invasion to be safely taken from 3 Ukrainian ports.
The ammonia pipeline Taliati-Odessa, unblocking accounts and financial activities to our fertilizer companies. These are the 5 problems that are continuing to exist.
The Kremlin, meanwhile, says a letter sent by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to President Vladimir Putin about the Black Sea grain deal had been passed on via diplomatic channels and was being considered. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov earlier said UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had sent a letter to President Vladimir Putin regarding the Black Sea grain deal and that there will be a reaction in due course. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson said a pact between Moscow and the United Nations for Russia's grain and fertilizer exports is not being fulfilled, and there are lots of details to be discussed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. North Korea's actions are a blatant violation of sanctions. These were the words of U.S. President Joe Biden at a press conference with South Korea President Yoon Suk-yeol. President Biden said the United States and South Korea are standing against economic leverage being used in coercive ways. The U.S. pledged to give South Korea more insight into its nuclear planning over any conflict with North Korea amidst anxiety over Pyongyang's growing arsenal of missiles and bombs.
Our mutual defense treaty is ironclad, and that includes our commitment to extended deterrence.
President of the United States, Joe Biden. Meanwhile, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has toured a NASA flight center as his country and the United States signed a joint statement to increase their collaboration in technology and space exploration. President Yoon underscored his vision for transforming South Korea into one of the world's top 5 leaders in space technology, with plans to reach the moon for resource extraction by 2032 and land astronauts on Mars by 2045. Yoon was joined by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, where he was speaking from the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. In her remarks, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris called the U.S.-South Korean alliance a linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, that is, and around the world. Now I would like to speak with Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, editor at the Odessa Review. It's so good to have you join us today.
Good morning. My pleasure to join you.
Now, the Chinese president's peace plan that was proposed concerning the Ukraine conflict was seen as vague in many points. And one of the recommendations that was criticized was that at the end of the day, if they followed this proposed peace plan from China, it'll end up giving maybe Russia a chance to retain those territories in Ukraine that it has already seized, this and other things of that nature. But now that the phone talk has been held between Zelensky and Xi Jinping, are you seeing a shift in China's position that they will be sincere in trying to broker a deal?
At this stage, there's no clear shift in the Chinese position. It is clear. What is clear is that China is very eager to participate in the diplomatic debate and the process to try and somehow create a peace process, a meaningful peace process, to try and move the war away from the hot phase. China has been very clear since it launched its initiative with its 12-point proposal in February. It's been very obvious that China is looking for a role in the peace efforts, in the diplomatic process. And yesterday's call was part of that, was a continuation of these efforts. However, we're not seeing a big shift in China's policy. China's main message is they would like to see a ceasefire. They would like to see a return to talks. Now, of course, a ceasefire would essentially freeze the conflict in its current positions. At this stage, Russia holds almost 20% of Ukrainian land in occupation. So the idea of freezing where we are today is absolutely unacceptable for Ukraine. Ukraine has been very clear, and President Zelensky, actually made a point yesterday following his conversation with the Chinese president of saying, we rule out any kind of land for peace deal, any kind of exchanges. We will not compromise on Ukraine's territorial integrity, Ukraine's sovereignty. That is not an option for Ukraine. So China's clearly looking to get involved. China's clearly attempting to demonstrate that it is a major global power, but it's not clear that they are ready to take the steps that certainly Ukraine is looking for in order to find some sort of potential common ground for a settlement.
Well, Mr. Dickinson, given the posture from Zelensky after that phone call, which seems a smack of optimism, does it not then go to show that from a Ukrainian perspective, China is going down a more conciliatory path, given that they're allies of Russia?
Well, the Chinese have actually been very careful since the beginning of the war in their messaging. Yes, they are seen broadly as allies of Russia, but they've actually tried to downplay that. We've seen a lot of positive messaging from the president of China, from Xi Jinping himself, but other members of the Chinese political establishment have actually come out and said, for example, the Chinese ambassador to the European Union, speaking to the New York Times earlier this month, said that talk of a friendship without limits between China and Russia was actually just rhetoric. It should not be taken at face value, and the ties between China and Russia were actually not as deep as some, certainly in the West, liked to imagine or did imagine. So it's not clear exactly the extent of this alliance between China and Russia. Certainly, China has not been overly critical of Russia. It's been very cautious in its criticisms of Russia. It has been far more critical of the West. It has accused the West of provoking the war in Ukraine. It's tried to downplay the idea that Russia is engaged in unilateral, imperial, essentially, aggression against Ukraine. So the Russian position is, Russia has tried to walk quite a delicate path, and now is looking to engage directly with Ukraine. Now, one would assume that this was not done simply speculatively, that the Chinese, by doing this, by reaching out to Ukraine, are looking to have some sort of concrete results from this. They're looking to make some sort of progress. China is very eager to be seen on the international stage as a serious global power, and a breakthrough towards peace in Ukraine would be a very, very good way of demonstrating that.
Do you see, therefore, this as an opportunity for mayhaps Ukraine to peel China away from Russia?
That's one of the expectations in Kiev. People are looking, I think peeling them away from Russia would probably be overly optimistic. I think at this stage, one of the main messages I saw yesterday and in Kiev and across Ukraine was the idea that as long as China is talking about a peace process, as long as China is publicly emphasizing its neutrality, it reduces the chance of China arming arming Russia, which of course is the big fear in Ukraine. There is a real concern in Ukraine that China would take on a far more significant role in the conflict and would begin to arm the Russians, would begin to provide Russia with significant military support in terms of missiles, in terms of artillery, perhaps also tanks. So that's the great fear in Kiev, and the sense is that as long as China's talking peace, that looks less likely. Now, whether Ukraine will be able to actually pull the Chinese away from their strategic relationship with Russia, that seems a little bit more optimistic and probably is not realistic at this stage. But even so, China's engagement is welcomed, primarily because it does reduce the chances of China becoming more involved on the Russian side, and increases the international pressure on Russia to look towards a resolution to the conflict.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to the Ukraine proposed counter-offensive, which was said to maybe be planned for around spring. But according to the Wagner mercenary leader, Brezhkovin, he says that they can expect Ukraine to launch a counter-offensive from the 2nd of May, which shall come as a secret that has been revealed, but that's what he's saying. So on his side, he's complaining that the mercenaries of Wagner are not getting enough equipment from Russia, but on the other side, as far as Ukraine goes, they don't have all the equipment that they've been promised. So do you see this spring counteroffensive as being successful, if it does happen?
Well, I think the timings here are crucial. Some people have begun referring to it, in fact, as a summer offensive, which gives you an idea of where we are today. There is no clear sense at this point of exactly when it will begin. The commander of US forces in Europe, General Cavoli, has been quoted yesterday saying that Ukraine has now received 98% of the military hardware, of the weapons and equipment and vehicles, which was promised to Ukraine by the country's international partners. So in that sense, it would seem they are in a position to begin. Other reports indicate that the actual readiness of the Ukrainian forces is significantly lower than that 98% figure. Anecdotally, I would say that's also my impression from speaking to people who are serving and people who are connected with the security sphere. They're not yet fully ready. Also, the weather is a big factor. At the moment in Ukraine, we have the spring thaw season, when essentially the ground becomes extremely damp. There's a lot of mud. It's very, very difficult for heavy armored vehicles, tanks and personnel carriers to move at all, even difficult in some places for cars to travel. So that would be a very limiting factor, and the expectation is that Ukraine must wait until the ground has fully hardened up before they can even contemplate an attack, which may well be in early May, it may be mid-May. That will depend, of course, on the weather conditions. So I would say that the likelihood is that the offensive will begin probably towards the second half of May, if not later. But we never know. You know, you can't be sure. The Ukrainian military has been very skilled at pulling surprises so far in this war. They've had a number of successes by taking the Russians by surprise, by offering feints and bluffs. So anything is possible, but I think they will wait. I don't see any real need for them to rush at this point. The Russians have launched their own offensive in recent months since the beginning of the year and have made very, very little progress. So the sense is that Russia's offensive capabilities are at a low at the moment. So Ukraine actually has a little bit of time in which to prepare itself and make sure it gets it right. Will it be a success or not? Well, this is the great unknown. Really, it's a huge gamble. Ukraine has trained very hard for this offensive. They have received a lot of very modern equipment from the country's Western partners. They have modern battle tanks. They have modern armored vehicles, other communications technologies as well, anti-mining technologies. So they should be in a position to do well, but we just don't know. Russia's also had a long time to build up its defenses. So Russia should also be quite confident of being in a position to rebuff any offensive. We'll have to wait and see. If Ukraine is successful, it will dramatically change the outlook for the future of the war and the potential peace process. But likewise, if the offensive fails, that will also have huge consequences for Ukraine.
Okay. Interesting you say maybe a summer offensive. We hope it doesn't become an autumn or winter offensive. But in this day and age of technology and the media and social media, and information gets carried along and passed across much quicker than in the old days. And for instance, we're talking about the days of an offensive. Don't you think the Russians have totally are preparing for this offensive, and they have their own plans to launch an attack?
Yes, of course. There is an enormous amount of information penetration on both sides. There are technological opportunities for the Russians to monitor Ukraine. Russia also has a large number, is believed to have a large number of agents and collaborators inside Ukraine who are prepared to provide information. Ukraine is constantly, on a daily basis, arresting people who are accused of providing Russia with detailed information of Ukrainian troop movements. So this is a major issue. Of course, Russia is not sitting passively. They're looking to prepare for their own. They're certainly looking to spoil Ukraine's offensive operations. They may also be plotting their own offensives. But Russia has been, by all accounts, on the offensive for a number of months. The fact is that it's been very, very unsuccessful. They've been trying to push at a number of points on the front line, 4 or 5 focuses of this offensive, essentially a winter offensive, and they've simply made very, very little headway. In Bakhmut has been the one place where they have advanced, but even on that front, we're talking about an advance of perhaps between 20 and 30 kilometers at most, which in a country the size of Ukraine is really negligible. So there is a sense that Russia does not currently have very much spare offensive capacity with which to launch an attack. So the expectation is that Russia will primarily be looking to defend against Ukraine's coming offensive, and will be looking to inflict very heavy costs on the Ukrainian forces to try and deter Ukraine, and crucially, to deter Ukraine's international partners, to say to them, look, guys, you're not going to be able to win this war militarily. You've got to come back to the negotiating table, and you have to compromise. You have to concede parts of Ukrainian land in order to end this war on Russian terms.
And after over 430 days of this war, one can lose sight of the pressure psychologically that the Ukrainian people are facing. In Kyiv, where you are at the moment, can you tell us what the people are saying on the streets? What's the mood, and what's the general feeling about this war amongst the people of Ukraine?
Well, I would say that the general spirit is still remarkably strong. Ukrainians have suffered enormously over the past 14 months of the war. The toll on the nation has been huge. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been forced to flee their homes and been displaced. More than 10 million people, in fact, and for everybody, it's been deeply psychologically damaging, deeply traumatic. But at the same time, there is enormous pride in the way the country has stood tall, and the way the military has performed, and the way the country in general has managed to rally around and support one another. And there is also a sense that there's really no option. I think that's possibly the most important aspect to get across when trying to explain the mood in Ukraine and in Kiev, is the sense that there's really no choice here. Russia has been very clear that it does not recognize Ukraine as a country. It does not recognize Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation. It sees Ukrainian national identity as an anti-Russian identity that must end. And so Ukrainians feel that if they do not continue the fight, do not continue to defend their country, there will be no country. It will simply cease to exist, as we're already seeing in the occupied parts of the country, where we are witnessing mass killings, mass deportations, ethnic cleansing, and the systematic eradication of Ukrainian identity. Of course, the mass deportations, the abductions of children have already led to war crimes charges against Putin personally, which tells its own story. But I think that once this war is over, the genocidal character of the war will become widely recognized internationally once all the evidence becomes clear. And certainly at this stage, Ukrainians overwhelmingly see it in those terms. So, of course, they're suffering. It's a very difficult time. People are experiencing, daily trauma. But on the other hand, they really see no other alternative. They must fight on, and they're very proud of the way that the country is fighting.
And some say the hardest part of a man to break is his spirit. Just ask the honey badger.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, editor at the Odessa Review, who joined us from Kiev. Thank you so much for your thoughts this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, conscripts in Crimea called up for Russian military service head off to army training camps. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. United States President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol have pledged to strengthen deterrence against North Korea, including sending nuclear-armed U.S. submarines and other military assets to South Korea. President Biden and President Yoon discussed the new agreement between the two countries, dubbed the Washington Declaration, in a joint news conference following their meeting in Washington, D.C., to mark the two countries' 70-year alliance. Yoon is only the second leader after France's Emmanuel Macron to be hosted in an official state visit at the White House since President Biden took office in 2021, which his administration says underscores the priority Washington is given to a key ally in the Indo-Pacific region. President Yoon says the new deterrence agreement represented an unprecedented expansion and strengthening of the bilateral strategy. It came as North Korea increased the pace of its weapons testing and unveiled an apparent recent breakthrough in its pursuit of solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, the Kremlin says the seizure of Western assets is a retaliatory move and it could be expanded. The Kremlin said Moscow's move to take temporary control of the assets of the Finnish energy group Fortum and its former German subsidiary Uniper was in retaliation for what it is called the illegal seizure of Russian assets abroad. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree establishing temporary control of the Russian assets of the two European state-owned energy firms. Now, the Kremlin spokesman, Mr. Dmitry Peskov, told reporters the decree did not concern ownership, just the power to manage the assets. It says the measure could be expanded to other assets if necessary. Now, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group private military company, has warned that World War III was nigh. The businessman turned mercenary leader echoed Russia's former president, now deputy head of the country's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who also issued a similar warning while speaking at a youth forum. He urges men to join the Wagner Group and says its members were ordinary lads only yesterday and now they should help to protect their country. The Wagner boss is recruiting new personnel as the PMC suffers heavy losses trying to seize the city of Bakhmut, where Wagner and regular Russian units face stubborn resistance from the defending Ukrainian forces. In Crimea, dozens of conscripts began their active service in Russia's military after a ceremony at an assembly point in the city of Simferopol. The new recruits were called up during the spring draft campaign that started on April the 1st. Yakub Niazez, a recent engineering graduate from the university in Kerch, says he volunteered for army service and showed up at an enlistment office without waiting for a draft paper. Another recruit says he was not a fan of the military but considered service in the army as his civil duty. Amongst those about to join the ranks were ethnic Crimean Tatars. They received a blessing from a Muslim clergyman, and Orthodox priests sprinkled a group of Christian recruits with holy water as well. A total of 2,500 people from Crimea are expected to join the ranks of the Russian armed forces during the current recruitment campaign. Some of them will serve in Crimea, others will be transferred to Russia. Now we're pleased to speak with Mr. Denis Soltis, a professor, Department of Public Administration and International Development in the Kimep University in Kazakhstan. It's very good to have you with us again this morning.
Yes, nice to be back. Nice to see you. But I don't see you. I hear you, but I don't see you. Where's your picture?
Okay, let's make do
now.
with the... Okay, fine. You can see me now.
Yes, yes.
That's great. Now, let's begin where you are in Kazakhstan. What role do you see Kazakhstan playing? Indeed, what role has Kazakhstan been playing? And do you see them as taking on any new postures concerning the war in Ukraine?
Well, no, I've talked about this before. Well, the Kazakh people, the public take Ukraine's side here because there are elements within Russia who would make claims on Kazakhstan's territory also. That's on the public side. On the geopolitical side, Kazakhstan is a small country, so it's, I think, just trying to ride out the storm, wait and see what happens. With the Western sanctions, Kazakhstan's trade with Russia has grown, but even so, each Central Asian country has even larger trade with China. And yet, about a year ago, I think Xi Jinping made a speech where he guaranteed or assured Kazakhstan of its territorial integrity. So still, Central Asia, Kazakhstan are, kind of in that balancing position between China and Russia. They're a small country, so I don't think, so they'll just try, to keep order in their own house, not give any the reasons for intervention by the larger powers. So they'll take quite a, status quo conservative position. That's about all they can do.
From the position of other countries close to you, such as Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan?
Sorry? Well, their position would be much the same. Their trade with China is also increasing. I think, well, it would be, I think, fairly apparent that, China is the rising power. So they'll hew to China.
Right. Now, concerning the United States now, and what's happening with South Korea, which you've also reported, and the meetings and the use of submarines, which I think was a game changer in marine warfare. And we know that North Korea is not in any way in bed with America concerning Ukraine. Do you see this dynamic playing any role in the war?
I'm not familiar with this. I'm not an East Asian specialist at all, and you surprised me. What's this, with this incident of the submarine? I thought you might talk about this alleged spying or that information leak.
Yes. We could go there if you want. For instance, we know that Navalny is under trial on the Russian side, but let me begin from this perspective now. Never was there a time such as this that I think, if you agree, or you will enlighten us if you may, that Russian patriotism is being tested. We have these elements in Russia who are Russian and who do not support the war. We have people who've been arrested. We see the move from President Putin and nationalists and Russian patriots who think this war is barking up the right tree. As far as support for Russia is concerned, and they've called it President Putin's war, do you think that sentiment will ever change in Russia amongst the Russian people to support this enterprise?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Do Russians support the war, is what you're asking?
I'm saying that the people in Russia who do not support the war, do you think they will grow in number, given the opposition from the people who are being arrested by President Putin and some disappearances and the clampdown on any dissent against the war?
You say low in number? Yes, I think they're low in number. And anyway, well, it's a very repressive regime there. So, it takes a very brave person to protest. So, I wouldn't expect much of a groundswell at all. Well, not a groundswell at all, if any kind of anti-war protest. If there is disappointment with there is disappointment among the super nationalists or those with the conduct of the war. And then some, again, on the sort of the pro-military, pro-war side of the spectrum, perceive the war as going badly. So that same person, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said, well, we need to negotiate. That is, they realize, the Russians believe these what shall we call them? Pro-war Russian factions, the militarists, yeah, many of them believe that the war is going badly and should be stopped, but still with the Russian forces in place as they are, with the territories in place as they are. Okay. And I don't see this, changing, and I don't see much of a, change in the broader public opinion in this regard. I think, the anti-war people are, there aren't many of them, and they're forced into silence anyway.
With the number of countries who are being involved in mediation and otherwise in this war, we have Brazil, we have other countries who are having a say, and those who have indeed been talking about this war and being involved in any way, including the European Union, given also the position that's happening between China and Taiwan. Do you see this as escalating into a bigger conflict now that, and do you see what he's saying as something that should be considered? World War III is nigh. I'm quoting Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of Wagner. Putin supporter Medvedev, former leader as well, says that that is likely to happen, that it is nigh. Are they pressing the panic button, and should we listen?
Well, first of all, who would fight against whom? Well, here now, I could speculate a little bit. Getting back to the other kind of interesting event of just 2 days ago, and that was the phone call between Xi Jinping and Zelensky. And I would characterize this as a useful non-event. And it's useful because it keeps, people talking. And as long as people are talking, then it sort of seems to reduce the military option. I think, and again, I emphasize, I'm not a China expert at all either, but I think what China is trying to do is go on a charm offensive. They made this, they brokered this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now they're trying to put some distance or drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, helped by some utterances that Macron made. And at the same time, they are sending some diplomats around within Europe to try to split the coalition against Ukraine within Europe. So they're trying to woo Italy and Hungary and France and potentially Germany. So I think for the moment, China is, and also China is interested in, ordinary economic cooperation. So I think for the moment, China is going that way for now. Talking and economic cooperation, and maybe trying to speculate or hold open the possibility of sort of loosening the links between the United States and Europe and within Europe's coalition against Ukraine, and then they could go back yet and then broker a peace on Russia's terms between Russia and Ukraine. So again, I emphasize I'm not a China specialist, and I can go only by, these general statements that were made recently, available to everybody. So that would be sort of where I think it's going. I think that, so for the moment, I think the temperature is, has been reduced a little bit.
Understood. We hope we see this as a ray of hope, and the glass is half full and not half empty concerning China.
Well,
Thank you so
nothing
much,
concrete. There's nothing concrete that came out of this meeting between Zelensky and Xi Jinping. They're just delaying the conversation.
Okay, we hope that.
But I don't see really. Huh?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, Mr. Dennis Soltis, Professor, Department of Public Admin and International Development in the Kimep University from Kazakhstan. I was saying that we hope that it does turn out to be more sincere than it appears to be, as you've been sharing with us with your insight. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Well, there's some way to go. Well, nice to see you again. Be well.
You too. When we return, Ukraine retrieves 44 prisoners of war from Russian custody. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. An Iranian court has ruled the United States government and a number of individuals and entities, including former President Barack Obama, must pay compensation for the 2017 attacks carried out by the armed group ISIL. Now, the court in the capital issued the verdict based on complaints by families of 3 people killed and 6 wounded during the June 2017 attacks in Tehran. The building of the Iranian parliament and the mausoleum of the founder of Iran's current establishment, Ruhollah Khomeini, were targeted during the daylight assault that killed 17 people in total. The court ruled that $9.95 million needs to be paid to compensate for financial damages, while $104 million and $199 million are for moral and punitive damages, respectively, the total nearing $313 million, which the Iranian court says that the United States must, or rather should, pay. And now for the business perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have our business correspondent, Laddie Williams, with me in the studio this morning. Laddie.
Good morning.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Russian oil exports dull the impact of OPEC production cuts.
Yeah, we got that.
They're still exporting.
Yeah, exactly.
Things are still, the wheel is still turning.
With
things are still going
all
on.
the heavy sanctions, we've seen on the Russian economy, but
yeah.
I think things are still working, at this point. We got that surprise cut from OPEC. That was about 3 weeks ago. They did cut oil output, going forward, and we saw how that, impacted the market. We saw prices jump about 6%. That was for Brent and WTI. But, fast forward to today, we're seeing those prices now below that $80 mark. All of that, the surprise effect has been dulled, and obviously now that's because we're seeing what's happening, with Russian exports. They've ramped up, exports, even though we see OPEC is trying to cut exports at this point for oil. And they've been selling, to India. India's imports from OPEC, that's dropped drastically in 2022 and 2023, and that's because obviously Russia has taken on that position, and they've been selling cheap oil to India and China. So we're seeing all of that, big jump from exports into Russia, dulling what the OPEC is trying to do to raise prices. We know the play between demand and supply in economics. Once you have, subdued supply, prices are going to go up. And if demand also stays up, but we're seeing, OPEC cutting supply, but Russia, on the other hand, getting all those exports out, that's for oil, raising, their supply to India and China, which are the big buyers at this point. So that's why we're seeing oil prices, tend downward at this time.
Are OPEC's measures, sorry to interrupt you, are OPEC's measures in any way affecting Russia in a significant fashion?
So definitely right now it's more of the oil price cap that's impacting Russia this time. OPEC, at the end of the day, they need their allies to cut, also cut production. But, with the way Russia is still sending out oil at this time, it's almost seeming like they're undermining OPEC at this point, because if OPEC is trying to cut production and you're, on the other hand, raising production, selling your oil actually cheaper, and we have big countries like India and China, buying all of that cheap oil. So at the end of the day, that's going to impact what OPEC is trying to do. So going forward, we're going to see what OPEC is going to do next. Is there going to be more cuts, or are they going to find a way to get Russia to also, stay in line? Because we're seeing their exports per day getting over that 2.4 million barrels. That's for Russia, sending out all that cheap oil. So still a lot of dynamics in that oil market, but we're seeing a lot of volatility, right now because of that interplay.
Laddie, one of those people or schools of thought ringing the alarm in the United States over the weakening of the dollar happens to be the Republican Party ahead of the 2024 presidential elections. Is a talking point for people who want to run against President Joe Biden, who says his fiscal policies are weak and that he's not getting the job done. Now, you're saying that the dollar is weakening ahead of the U.S. GDP release.
Later today. Yeah, we've seen a lot of pressure on the U.S. dollar with, blocks like BRICS, talking about moving away from trading with the U.S. dollar. We've seen Russia also, mount pressure and moving away from the U.S. dollar for trade because of the sanctions. So we've seen them try to push out new policies from trading with the central bank digital currencies, trying to get that pilot out. So at the end of the day, we've seen the DXY, that's dropped big from the last rally to about 114 points against a basket of currencies. But now we're seeing it drop to about 101 points as the DXY, which tracks the US dollar and about 6 other currencies. So at the end of the day, we're seeing this drop. We're expecting GDP data for the US later today. That's going to give direction. Expectations is 2.0%, which is lower than 2.6% from first quarter in 2022. So all of that is going to play into what the U.S. Fed is going to do next with rates. We're expecting 25 basis points and some kind of pivot from this next rate hike. Analysts are expecting that the U.S. is going to, cool off on raising rates, going forward. And we know how raising rates is what strengthened the dollar so much last year, took it up to 114 points for the DXY. So now, all indications is that the U.S. Fed is going to, slow down on rate hikes. So we're seeing that already impacts the U.S. dollar. It's already weakening. And we're already seeing countries talking about, trading with their own currencies, with other countries. So all of that, putting pressure on the dollar at this moment.
Thank you, Laddie. More on business news after the program on Business Morning.
Thank you.
Now, a senior Ukrainian presidential advisor says Ukraine has retrieved 44 prisoners of war from Russian custody. Ukraine State Security Service released footage on social media purportedly showing newly released Ukrainian prisoners of war just after returning from Russian captivity. Andriy Yermak wrote on the Telegram messaging app that 42 were soldiers and 2 were civilians, and that some of those freed had injuries sustained during torture. The two sides have held regular prisoner exchanges during Russian invasion of Ukraine, now in its 15th month. And that's it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Do have a good day.